What's up everyone? Welcome to a Tidal Gardens Coral Spotlight. If this is your first time here, Tidal Gardens is a coral farm located in Copley, Ohio, and on this channel, we talk about all things coral reef aquarium related. One of the things that we like to do on this channel is a deep dive into a specific genus of coral, and that's what we're going to do today with Australomussa. If you've never heard of this coral, it's understandable. They are an uncommon coral in the trait to begin with, and they're not even talked about much online. Furthermore, they go by a bunch of different names. Let me explain. These corals are imported as Australomussa roliensis. However, researchers reclassified them about 5 years ago into the genus Parascolymia. This genus sounds vaguely familiar, doesn't it? Sounds like scolemia, and the para prefix has a few different meanings, but roughly translates to adjacent, near, or resembling. So the term parascolymia would indicate something close to scolemia. These corals, though, only have a passing resemblance to what are normally thought of as scolemia in the hobby, which tend to be a single polyp and a bit more fleshy in appearance. That observation was not lost on coral taxonomists, and as such, the ever-popular Scolemia australis was bumped into the genus Homophilia. As an aside, also bumped into Homophilia were corals that were once Acanthastria bowerbanki, and you can see more of a resemblance there between these two. You might be thinking, what is even left in the Scolemia genus if the australis species was booted out? Well, for one, it leaves Scolemia vidiensis, and now that looks a lot more like this Parascolymia / Australomussa. They both have this very flat growth form with large polyps and a spiky skeleton that you can get a hint of on the surface of the coral. For the sake of this video, I'm just going to call them Australomussa. A few people know this coral by this name, but almost nobody knows it by Parascolymia. And who knows, by the time that you actually watch this video, it might be reclassified again, so I'm not exactly married to these labels. Like I said before, this is one of the coral categories that has seen a lot of shuffling recently, and we could see a lot more in the future. Taxonomy aside, Australomussa is a very uncommon large polyp stony coral in the hobby, and one that a lot of people aren't too familiar with. So now that we've gone over some of the background info on Australomussa, let's get into their care requirements. Australomussa are photosynthetic corals, meaning that they get nutrients from the products of photosynthesis carried out by symbiotic dinoflagellates called zooxanthellae living in their flesh. Zooxanthellae utilize chlorophyll to absorb light and produce simple sugars that the coral can utilize for energy. Some corals rely on this energy source more than others and will need brighter lighting. Australomussa, however, tend to be less demanding of light intensity and may actually fare better in dimmer tank conditions. We try to place Australomussa in low to medium light intensity, which is around 50 to 100 par. If your tank is higher in light, it might take some time for this coral to adjust to its new surroundings. When in doubt, try lower lighting intensities until it's really clear that the coral is stable before ramping up those lights. Remember that lighting that is too bright risks damaging the coral, and this damage can happen very quickly. If you start to see the coral turning lighter and bleaching out, it's time to move it to a dimmer location. It is possible for an Australomussa that's been bleached to recover, but it can take a long time. During this time, it may also retract tight against its spiky skeleton, and the tips might poke through the skin, which could lead to other health problems. If your coral did retract and bleach, what might help is to relocate it to a low area section of the aquarium, and then aggressively feed it. More on feeding in a bit. Aside from the nutritional aspects of lighting, let's consider the aesthetics. Australomussa do fluoresce, but not as intensely as some other corals. Their appearance, however, does change substantially depending on the color temperature of the lighting provided. Now, what looks best is a matter of opinion. I like them in slightly bluer light, right around 14 to 18,000 Kelvin. When the color temperature is warmer, let's say in the 10,000 Kelvin range, I think that some of the colors are just drowned out by that daylight coloration. Mind you, we're talking about the presentation of the coral for viewing, not the actual color of the coral. Australomussa do not appear to change color very much, as that coloration remains relatively consistent. Some corals, such as say Micromussa, can really color shift, but like I said, that's not really so much the case with Australomussa. While it may be possible to get away with keeping Australomussa with lighting alone, I think that this coral benefits greatly from consistent feeding every 2 to 3 days. Corals that are well fed tend to grow faster and can handle stress conditions better than corals that are malnourished. They can be fed either frozen food or specialized LPS dry foods. The problem with feeding Australomussa is that it's not the most aggressive feeder. Feeding takes some patience because, well, first of all, it takes some time for it to start eating, and then care must be taken to allow it to actually consume the food. We've had the best luck turning off all the flow in the aquarium and then giving it a light dusting to activate what little feeding response that they have. After a minute or two, we can put some larger pieces of food on them and allow them to eat it over the next 10 to 20 minutes. During this time, if you have fish or inverts around, they may eat the food sitting on top of the coral, which is clearly not helpful. The bigger concern with feeding is that certain fish and inverts, such as shrimp and crabs, can cause major damage to a coral when they go after the food. Fish stealing the food out of the coral's mouth is one thing, but if you have tank mates that rip a coral apart to get at the food, yeah, something more drastic has to be done. There are a few different ways to go about this. When it's time to feed your corals, try feeding the fish and other critters in advance. So if you have tangs, for example, give the herbivores a fresh clip of nori on the opposite end of the aquarium. If you keep the fish occupied, the coral should have time to digest its meal. If that isn't successful, another option is to create a feeding barrier of some sort. You can DIY something out of a container, or you can go with a commercially produced feeding cage. If you want to get even fancier, I'm sure that there's plans on the internet for 3D printed coral cages that would allow for this type of feeding. Let's move on to water flow. Australomussa appreciate low to medium flow. There's two things that I'm looking to accomplish with flow for this coral. The first is to give it just enough flow to keep it clean. Detritus buildup can cause the coral to die back if it's allowed to collect right on top. Providing flow around the coral prevents that accumulation. Even moderate flow can serve to keep the coral clean, as the coral does a good job of sloughing off debris that settles on it. Also, its flat shape, for whatever reason, does a really good job of deflecting flow, so a lot of times light debris like detritus has a harder time settling on it. Too much flow will cause its flesh to be drawn tight to the skeleton all the time, which again is a very bad thing considering how spiky that skeleton is. Worst case scenario, the skeleton pokes through the skin and the tips start to grow nuisance algae, which then further causes the coral to die back. Providing periodic low flow, or even zero flow, is beneficial for this coral for the purposes of feeding. I actually prefer completely turning off the flow to feed because, again, Australomussa has that flat shape that is so good at deflecting flow, and that deflection prevents food from settling down on it. As for the chemical parameters for this coral, Australomussa doesn't have any unique requirements that set it apart from any other LPS. There are the pollution parameters to look out for, and the three main building block parameters. Now, starting first with the pollution parameters, the two main ones to keep track of are phosphate and nitrate. Phosphate and nitrate are these great general measurements of water cleanliness. They show up mainly in the food that we provide the tank, but decaying plant and animal matter can also elevate those levels in the water. We generally shoot for about 5 to 10 parts per million nitrate, and anything from 0.05 to 0.1 parts per million of phosphate. If nitrate levels get too high, corals may react negatively by taking on a more drab coloration, or in really bad situations, start dying back suddenly. If phosphate levels are too high, it may feed into an unwanted algae bloom or spur the growth of other undesirable organisms that can stifle the growth of corals. For a short period there was a push in the hobby to have near zero levels of both nitrate and phosphate. And you can do this through techniques like using GFO or through carbon dosing, which can aggressively bring those numbers down. Ultra low nutrient levels, though, come with their own set of issues. There is such a thing as water that's too clean, and I would argue that the problems that are caused by near zero nutrient levels are much worse than those that are caused by an abundance of these nitrates and phosphates. Corals require some level of nitrate and phosphate to be bioavailable in the water. When they get starved out, the corals first take on this shrunken, emaciated look, and then they could start dying off after that. Even if the corals aren't dying off, there is this other risk for blooms such as like brown dinoflagellates that thrive in those ultra low nutrient conditions. For Australomussa specifically, I would rather see nitrate and phosphate levels on the high side than barely detectable or zero, because we've kept them in systems with very high nutrient with little to no difficulties. Moving on from the water cleanliness parameters, let's consider the building block parameters. Those are calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium. Because Australomussa are stony corals, these are the three main chemical parameters that are needed by the coral to build its skeleton. So starting first with calcium, it's one of the major ions in salt water. In the ocean, its level hovers right around 425 parts per million, and as a stony coral grows, the calcium is absorbed from the water and used to form that calcium carbonate skeleton. Alkalinity is a collection of ions that generally equate to the carbonate availability in the water. Technically, it is the amount of acid required to lower the pH of salt water to the point that bicarbonate turns into carbonic acid. If you have more alkalinity, it can soak up more of that acid. Less alkalinity, and you have less buffering capacity, making the tank more susceptible to those chemical changes. In natural seawater, the alkalinity measures around 7 to 8 dkH, though most salt mixes these days mix up closer to 8 to 9 dkH. Some aquarists like to overload this parameter a little to keep their tanks, let's say, right around 10 or 11 dkH. And the thinking there is that elevated calcium and alkalinity contributes to faster stony coral growth. In practice, alkalinity tends to be the parameter that fluctuates the most. So if you can only manage to test for one parameter frequently, test for alkalinity. Last point that I'm going to make about water chemistry is that stability is the goal. Even if one or two parameters are off a little bit, it's better for you to remain consistent at that level than for you to try to change those values quickly. Now, if both calcium and alkalinity are low, raising them up together can be tricky because calcium ions and carbonate ions want to react with one another. The addition of a calcium supplement often comes with a corresponding fall in alkalinity, and the opposite is also true. If you're experiencing this in your systems, small fluctuations are normal, but wild swings are not. If you're getting these huge swings of calcium and alkalinity every time that you use an additive, you might want to look at your magnesium levels. In short, magnesium acts to increase the overall availability of alkalinity compounds in the water, and that kind of evens out those chemical swings. In the ocean, magnesium sits at around 1350 parts per million. Okay, having gone over all of that, I have to point out that Australomussa is a very slow-growing stony coral and isn't likely the cause of any major fluctuations that you might be seeing in your water. There are definitely some fast-growing corals out there that can single-handedly drop your levels as they grow, but Australomussa, not one of them. I bring up these parameters because stability in the water is really what you're going to be shooting for, and if you do that right, it's going to give you the best chances of success for not only this coral, but all the others in your tank. Now that we've gone over the care requirements for Australomussa, can we breed them, frag them, propagate them, anything? The simple answer is maybe. It really depends on what your expectations are. Australomussa are extremely slow growing, so if your goal is to cut off a piece of a larger colony to share with a fellow hobbyist, yeah, that's possible. They can be cut with something like a diamond-bladed bandsaw and healed over time. If we're talking about commercial aquaculture, propagation isn't likely the solution because it would take entirely too long. One future solution may be sexual reproduction, and with the advances in the area happening fairly rapidly, it isn't completely out of the question although it would require a considerable grow out area for a long period of time, which would undoubtedly result in a huge price increase on admittedly an already expensive coral. Sexual breeding could also potentially produce some interesting hybrids and color morphs, so maybe in boutique operations this might become a thing. But for right now, the prospects of aquacultured Australomussa is not the best. Okay, that about does it for Australomussa. So what kind of tank is this best suited for? I see Australomussa as a showpiece LPS for hobbyists that are looking for something different. Not too many people are even aware of this particular coral, and there's some amazingly beautiful examples out there. So if you have an LPS dominated tank, are looking for that signature showpiece that you basically don't see in other people's tanks or even online very often, this might be an option for you. Hopefully this video is helpful for those looking to try them for the first time. If you'd like more information or perhaps purchase Australomussa for your home aquarium, I invite you to visit us at tidalgardens.com and see what we have in stock. We're always on the lookout for these oddball corals and interesting color morphs to add to the collection. Alright, until next time, happy reefing.